God has a hard-on.
Perfect world was a dream that primitive cerebrals.
He's a traitor! He's a sadist!
You're all going to die down here.
The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
Happy heresies, my beloved truth seekers. Welcome so much to Aeon Byte, formerly known as Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis, or Coffee, Coffin Nails, and Gnosis. Welcome so much to that dream of you, broadcast from the virtual Alexandria through the GodAboveGod.cam.
Monsieur has been lost!
Welcome so much on this approximately Saturday, November 22nd, the year of our Demiurge 2008. I am Abraxas, your psychopomp from the rotten ship graveyards of the material world to the farthest shores of imagination.
In the absence of light, darkness prevails. There are things that go bump in the night, Agent Myers. Make no mistake about that. And we are the ones who bump back.
And you got it. We are the Gnostics and the lovers of the esoterica. We are the spiritual vigilantes of the subtle holocaust that is creation. Our language is contraband, our secrets are impossible to express, and our legacy is tears and blood. We are exiled princes, the orphans of hell, and the burning feathers of Icarus. Divided we stand, together we rise, a small minority of misfits, artists, freethinkers, and arcane jesters. We have outwardly waged war against orthodoxy, literalism, and fundamentalism for many ages, without any violence, only with the napalm truth of our words and poetic theater.
There are two kinds of evil people. People who do evil stuff and people who see evil stuff being done and don't try to stop it.
We have inwardly waged war against forgetfulness, ignorance, and our porcupine ego since our first mortal incarnation, when we fell from the Ein Sof, the limitless light, down into the gangrene, web-laden uterus we call the cosmos.
Quite an experience to live in fear, isn't it? That's what it is to be a slave.
Plato said all learning is remembering. The Buddha didn't become enlightened under the Bodhi tree. No, he discovered he had been enlightened the whole time. Atlas shrugged once, but Prometheus reached for the fire of the lower angels that was ours by inheritance. And we will never, ever quit in our revolution to make sure Hypatia of Alexandria makes it home this time, before the Christian mob tears her to pieces with seashell shards and filthy wood splinters. Sophia looks after us from the Ogdode. Simon Magus weaves those spells that keep us safe in the realms of myth and possibility. And the Logos within us always reminds us that the kingdom of the Father is spread out everywhere, but hidden by the soul-numbing cellophane Jehovah and his angelic mafia have wrapped over the commonwealths of reality and unreality.
This place is kept by powerful gods!
Like Emile Cioran once wrote, injustice governs the universe. All that is made and all that is unmade, the rain carries the imprint of a corrupt fragility, as if matter were the fruit of an outrage in the womb of nothingness.
Goal in life is not to eliminate misery, it's to keep misery to the minimum.
So light up a cigarette, cigar, sandalwood incense, or some picture of you smiling, pretending you were happy at some shallow event when all you wanted to do was scream at the world that didn't understand you. Make sure you've got some fuel in your cup, because coffee is for closers. and then do and think of the most politically incorrect thing you can before we get started. We're just tired of being told what to think, what to feel, and just how to act.
You're not your job. You're not how much money you have in the bank. You're not the car you drive. You're not the contents of your wallet. You're not your fucking khakis. You're the all-singing, all-dancing crap of the world.
Tommy, can you hear me? Yes, he can, my beloved true seekers, for the Gospel of Thomas has been hearing us since it was discovered, both in a Greek parchment over 100 years ago and also in the Nag Hammadi library. It's been hearing our opinions and interpretations, being the most popular of all apocryphal works out there. Even pagans, anarchic Jews, liberal Catholics, and independent Protestants have become fond of its message.
How do you fight an idea, especially a new idea?
Many of us have read the herds of books on this heterodox holy writ. Scholars will give us a saying, or logio in Greek to sound smart, contrasted to the folios of orthodoxy, guess its geographical and theological source, put forth some insipid explanation on its coloring, and that will be that.
Scholars maintain that the translation was lost hundreds of years ago.
Others, more occult-minded cats, will accord us with their personal interpretation, crisscrossing it with other esoteric schools, and that will be that as well.
People that talk in metaphors ought to shampoo my crotch.
But Tommy, can you hear me? Or Tommy, do we listen to you once in a while? Are we really paying attention to you, or just projecting our Greek masks into such an approachable scripture from the twin of a character named Jesus Christ? Honestly, I really can't say, because the Gospel of Thomas is fundamentally endless and shifting like the sands of the planet Dune. It transforms me in a seminal way every time I read it, opens sidewalks of self-knowledge I didn't know were there before.
Written with the finger of God.
This gospel, which really isn't a gospel, is like a marker on where I'm relative to my path back to the palm tree garden Philip K. Dick wrote about. But that's just me, and in this eternal now, our guest has a very impressive, innovative, and analeptic way to unlock both psychological and spiritual mysteries of the fifth gospel, as it is known.
Don't act like you're not impressed.
With us, we have the pleasure of housing at the Virtual Alexandria Robert North, author of The Way of Life, Volume 1, The Child and the Lion. This is not just another tome on the Gospel of Tommy Boy, but a maiden manner to approaching it. You see, Robert's story is like so many of our stories with all its variances. From a Jesuit to a therapist to a biblical teacher and eventually a heretic, part of his gnosis manifested in startling SPLs about the fifth gospel.
This is awe-inspiring stuff.
What if the numbering of the sayings were placed in the wrong order? What if there are thematic strata and sections that castrate our ever-aggressive ego? Even more, what if the Gospel of Thomas is actually a book of chiastic poetry that, if read and understood the correct way, would, with a vengeance, mutate or perhaps supercharge the various apothegms? Beyond a volume of verses, what if the Gospel of Thomas was intended to be a volcanic clarion call to revolution against all doctrines, all dogmas, all earthly institutions, all societal structures, all of our counterfeit selves, and not just a nice list of pithy declarations that make you feel tingly and good at the end of the day?
Get off my tits!
Quite radical, my beloved true seekers? But radically interpreting everything, including reality, is what Gnostics do best.
Well, I've wrestled with reality for 35 years, Doctor, and I'm happy to state I finally won out over it.
In our interview, Robert will even bestow a lesson you can take right there and then on how to unleash the psycho-spiritual monsoon that is actually inside Tommy's gospel. And maybe Tommy will hear us and utilize a defibrillator of storm lightning gnosis over our chloroform hearts. Either way, check out his book, because beyond decoding the Gospel of Thomas, Robert shares his supramundane discoveries on Gnosticism he has cultivated for many years. The way of life is informative and technical, but at the same time inspirational, with various insights into escaping the greatest fear any Gnostic has. And that is being normal, being mundane, being accepted by a clapping world of Xerox humans, and being just another wallflower on the rooms of the mansions of the vain gods.
I am so alone.
For more information on Robert North and the way of life, please visit his website, 7771.org. That is 7771.org. Several scholars, like Elaine Pagels, are already interested in his theories, and you can interact with Robert at his homepage.
Did you see the memo about this?
Of course, there are many doubting Thomases who say the Gospel of Thomas is not even Gnostic. They claim with their internet forum bravado that it's from some mystical Syrian school of Christianity, or from an Alexandrian tradition that constantly edit the Proverbs. They also say that it's really cue and drag, or a porridge of Jewish wisdom sayings.
The lady doth protest too much.
Whatever, dudes. That's fine and all, but let's look at some of its pertinent themes, shall we? The main one, or perhaps the most important one, is self-knowledge, which, like Clement of Alexandria wrote, is God knowledge. It also talks about repudiating the world, and more importantly, the orthodox laws imposed by the archons.
I owe it to the world to make sure this evil never sees the light of day.
The Gospel of Thomas also talks about searching, seeing, and experiencing what is truly real, that which cannot be truly seen, heard, or felt, but it really can with our higher mind. The Gospel of Thomas talks about creating interior balance and harmony for a greater task ahead, uniting all dualities, and making the male and female into one like the bridal chamber of the Valentinians. It speaks of being authentic, honest, and with perspective to the charades of various systems. In other words, being just healthy in reason and emotion, for the Gnostics were known as history's first death psychologists.
Sell crazy someplace else. We're all stocked up here.
And if that's not enough, how about the secret mythology of the Gnostics, disguised in its logia? Didn't I just sound smart? 3 examples are these. There is saying number 11, in which Jesus says, "This heaven will pass away, and the one above it will pass away." Gee, I wonder who the one above heaven will pass away is. Could it be the architect of the Matrix?
Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself.
Or this one, in saying number 7, Jesus said, "The Father's kingdom is like a woman who was carrying a jar full of meal. While she was walking along a distant road, the handle of the jar broke, and the meal spilled behind her along the road. She didn't know it. She hadn't noticed a problem. When she reached her house, she put the jar down and discovered that it was empty." Sounds like something that happened to Hagia Sophia in the Sethian creation narratives. if you look at it closely and with your third eye.
That's it, man. Game over, man. It's game over.
And lastly, how about this one? Saying number 7, in which Jesus says, "Lucky is the lion that the human will eat, so that the lion becomes human. And foul is the human that the lion will eat, and the lion still will become human." Doesn't Yaldabaoth, or in his prosaic name of God, the son of Sophia, have a lion's face? And doesn't God really mean our own ego? Who knows? Hey, maybe I've been just drinking too much Mountain Dew with chasers of cough syrup.
Fat, drunk, and stupid is no way to go through life, son.
But fundamentalist apologists, Gnostic professors who are one university tenure from being Orthodox bored and have long jumped the shark, or lay scholars who will never be happy until Jesus is Jewish and his Torah falling as a fiddler on the roof, will raise their intellectual pitchforks at all of this.
Who is on the Lord's side? Let him come to me.
Let's throw Occam's razor out the door. Let's always claim the Gnostics only knew how to write stories that were like acid-induced primordial Alice in Wonderland ripoffs. And let's never imagine that the words of Tommy, St. Paul, Valentinus, or Mary Magdalene are trademarked by the realm of myth, and thus like dreams have endless possibilities, hidden Excaliburs in the rocks of our brains, and ever-changing textures.
Your whole life is just a dream.
If it means something, it means something, and something only, they'll tell you. Just like the, so honest words you tell your lovers and friends and co-workers every day. Row, row your friggin' boat. London Bridge is falling down on them, and they don't even know it. Tommy, can you hear me? Ah, that deaf, dumb, blind scribe sure can play a real mean gospel ball. But enough of my drivel. I have barely touched the tip of the esoteric foreskin. Robert North, in discussing the way of life, will present to you so much more wisdom about this wisdom literature, as well as a cornucopia of tools that might make you never even look at the Bible in the same way.
The Bible is basic instructions before leaving Earth.
I think Thomas is finally listening. And if Thomas is listening, then his twin, Jesus, is as well. And we all know by now, in Aeon Byte, where the Christ truly makes his home, in each one of us. With us today, we have Robert North, and we will be discussing his new book, The Way of Life, Volume 1, The Child and the Lion. How are you doing today, Robert? Or can I call you Bob?
Call me Bob. And Miguel, I want to correct you. The author of the book I'm claiming is Jesus of Nazareth. I see myself as more of the commentator and the translator. And of course, the book we're talking about is the Gospel of Thomas. I argued in the book that there's plenty of evidence to say that Jesus left us a book, and that we've been misunderstanding the title of the Gospel of Thomas. It really, he was the scribe. He might have helped Jesus, but he was clearly the scribe.
Well, I'm sure we'll get to it. But before we get into the book, Bob, could you tell us a little bit about your background and your evolution from a Jesuit, counselor, management consultant, and how all those careers and everything led you to writing about the Gospel of Thomas?
I was raised a Catholic, and when I was 20 years old, went into the Jesuits. And for those who don't know who the Jesuits are, they're kind of, it's a Catholic order of priests. They live in community. They run major universities and colleges throughout the United States and actually throughout the world. They also are missionaries. They take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And so I went in at the age of 20, and I think I went in because I really had a close relationship with God and with Jesus, and I wanted to give my life, I think, to people and to spirituality. But it was interesting. Once I got in there, I ran into a lot of tension in the Jesuits that I didn't for the first time in my life, and had what I call a partial nervous breakdown. I mean, I just really was exhausted in there. And when that happened, I began to ask for the first time in my life how spirituality related to mental health. What was Jesus' answer for becoming joyful in any kind of situation? My career began to take a fork there. Later, after 4 years, the Jesuits put you into a program of 2 years of intensive philosophy. And when I was in that program, I learned that there were two approaches to philosophy. One that some people call objectivism, and the other which is called phenomenology. Now, to explain those two terms, when we describe the world in objective, logical terms, that's very different than doing it describing one's personal experience. Thomas Aquinas, for example, studied the nature of man logically. In the Jesuits, we used the subjective or phenomenological method. We studied how our experience as our personal experience as a man could be expressed. What I didn't understand then was that huge difference between looking at reality objectively and looking at it subjectively was really the difference between what we know as objective religion and Gnosticism. I was being introduced to the Gnostic Method, which I consider the Gnostic Method of knowing, which I consider to be phenomenological. Gnosticism, in my judgment, is the study of one's experience of oneself, of others, the world, and how to become a fully developed person in the world. But the key word is experience. You start with your own experience. In other words, Gnostics study their experience, compare it with that of others, and arrive at what I would call relatively objective truths. But really, it's just two people comparing experiences, or three people comparing experiences. That's phenomenology, and that's what I call Gnosticism, or one part of Gnosticism. Now that I'm into, and I've been studying Gnosticism for a long time, I'm realizing that there's many documents that are called Gnostic that really are not phenomenological, but the authors seem to be conveying objective philosophy or theology. And so people, I think, are confused because they're not realizing that that the Gnostic literature is of two different kinds. One objective, the other phenomenological.
Could you give us some examples of objective gospels out there?
Let's take the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They are describing experiences. People look at them historically as a historical document, but they're really describing how Jesus experienced the world and how we might experience the world. An objective work would be, say, the letters of Paul. Paul was stating objective beliefs and objective laws.
But how can you be a Catholic who preaches objective truths and still be a budding Gnostic?
That was the problem. Once here I was learning and to understand my own experiences, find my own answers, and the Catholic Church kept telling me, no, here are the answers. Here's the way you should see God. When I kept experiencing God my way and kept evolving, and I found myself and many of the Jesuits were quite confused. That later led me to come to the conclusion that I was supporting a church that I felt was destructive. Now, that's a strong word, but here's what I mean. instead of encouraging people to make their own discoveries daily about themselves and God and life, I found that the church was trying to control how people thought and acted according to their very objective truths. I felt confined, I felt imprisoned, I felt that that was destructive of the human spirit, that it prevented us from growing. And so after 6 years, I left the Jesuits and I left the Catholic Church precisely because I guess I had become a Gnostic and didn't know it at the time.
And Bob, before that, you talk in your bio about you even as a Catholic, you had mystical experiences, experiences with the divine. How does the Catholic Church deal with that?
The Catholic Church, I think, is marvelous in that it supports those kinds of experiences. And in the Jesuits, you felt almost schizophrenic. On the one hand, you were supposed to have divine revelations, and you were encouraged to have divine revelations, but at the same time, you were not to act on them as long as if it violated any rules. And the Jesuits was full of rules, and the Catholic Church is full of rules. So it was always kind of strange. I mean, it was very, as I can say, almost schizophrenic. You developed a personal relationship with God. You developed, and you were taught to nurture that. You were taught to make your own decisions. You were taught to not to live from the heart, but then you were also taught to take a vow of obedience and follow objective laws. And so I felt very confused.
And how did later on, how did your experience when you entered the University of Florida temper your viewpoints, or how did it help with your evolution?
When I left the Jesuits, I deliberately was looking for a phenomenological approach to psychology. I was still trying to answer the question, how can you be a fully developed person in the world and a very happy person no matter what happened to you? That was a very, very important question to me. And so I went to the University of Florida and enrolled in a doctoral program in counseling. I soon learned that the answers weren't there. I didn't think that people knew how to become a complete human being. And I began to study research that showed that half of the therapists and half of the helpers in the world, according to the research studies, not only didn't help people, but made them worse. And that really was shocking to me. And so I left the university, I got the degree and left, and quite frankly felt quite disillusioned. It was at that point that I went back to studying the Gospels, and I began to study under various professors in a private way while teaching at several universities. Gradually, my expertise in Scripture studies became studying how the books of the Bible, and particularly the New Testament, were intended to be organized by their authors. For example, how did Mark really want his gospel organized? He did not break it into 16 chapters as we have it today, and he did not break it into verses. That was done 1,200 years after he lived. But if you study that gospel, you can see clues for how it is organized, and I became fascinated with it, and that became my specialty.
And then when did the Gospel of Thomas come into the picture, Bob?
Fortunately, in 1999, there were a number of interlinear translations came out, and I was led to study I didn't know Coptic, but I was led to study the Gospel of Thomas using those interlinear translations. I just happened to discover Gnosticism on the internet, so that was just about 10 years ago. And when I looked at the research, I found that scholars were saying that the Gospel of Thomas was a random collection of sayings. I thought, well, that's interesting. And then they said, well, over half of these sayings we've known about in some way from the four Gospels. So I sat down one evening and read through the Gospel of Thomas, and using my training in looking for organization and structure of a text, I recognized immediately that this was not a random collection of sayings. There was a tremendous order progression. After about the second reading, I discerned 11 clear chapters. And it's not hard for anybody to find them because 9 of them end with a poem about listening. For example, in poem in saying number 8, we read, "He who has ears to hear, let him, or ears to listen, let him listen." That saying ends a number of chapters, and there are other chapters that have a poem or a saying that ends with the phrase, that concludes the phrase listening. And what I think is that Jesus wrote this, he dictated it before he died, obviously before he died to Thomas, who was scribe, and then in the course of the centuries, we lost the ability to see all of his organizational clues, and the gospel is absolutely filled with them. It is far more. It is one of the most organized, brilliantly organized texts that I've ever run into.
And Bob, why exactly do you call them poems?
Well, after I recognized that there were 11 chapters, I couldn't figure out what the organization was within the chapters. And it took me literally years of trying different methods until it dawned on me. I said, well, why don't I look for a chiasm? A chiasm is an arch. When I began to look for it, I began to see it everywhere. And then I had to discern what were the rules that Jesus was using to put this material into an arch form. And I've articulated those rules in the book. And once I figured out those rules, then the whole gospel, the entire book, fell out beautifully into poems. For example, the saying 1, which everybody recognizes, that begins with it's a 3-part poem. It's not one saying; it's a 3-part poem. And the other chapters all have poems. And what is so interesting is that the poems within the chapter are also arranged in an arch. And then to make it even more fascinating, the entire 11 chapters are meant to be read in an arch form. So to me, it's just absolutely amazing.
Can you give us an example of these arches or poems?
Yeah, I can. If people listening would take I'm going to give a second for them to grab a pen and a piece of paper. We can do it right here together.
You heard it, listeners. Grab a pen and a paper and let's go. Okay, they should be ready or they can pause it. Why don't we go?
All right. What I'd like to ask you all to do is to draw an arch on your piece of paper, to go up, across the top, and down like an arch, all right? Like an arch in a door. Now on the lower left of your arch, would you write the word he, H-E? At the top of the arch, on line 1, would you write who, under it, has his ear, and under that, to listen. So who has his ear to listen is at the top of the arch. At the bottom right of the arch, write, let him listen. Now, what I discovered was that the top of the arch, the stanza at the top, is always the most important stanza, and it's called the Keystone Stanza. One of the rules in putting a poem, a saying into an arch and into a poem, is that each stanza is a clause. So in this mini poem, this is the 3rd part of saying 8. You've got 3 stanzas, and they are in an arch. In the book, I explain extensively how to read a poem in an arch. Were you doing that, Miguel?
In my head. I've got too much.
You got too much to do, all right.
Yeah, I'm over here playing with stuff. So what do we get exactly? What do we get when this happens?
As I said, you got the first stanza is opposite and it's called parallel to the third stanza. And the two stanzas, when they're parallel, either explain or complement each other. And then the force of the whole poem is as I said, is the keystone. Now you notice that the poem that is a different kind of poem. It is that you don't see rhyme, and we expect a poem. Sometimes we expect a poem to rhyme, and that isn't true in biblical. In some biblical poetry, it is, but in most that is in an arch, that is not the case.
Can we do another example just so the reader knows?
I think everybody is familiar with the first saying of the gospel. So folks draw another arch, and the last part of the saying of the first saying is also a three-stanza arch. So at the lower left, we write, whoever is the one, and then in the keystone you write, who discovers the meaning of these words? Who discovers the meaning of these words? And on the right, in the lower right, you write, he will take a taste, not of death. He will take a taste, not of death. In the keystone stanza is the thrust, not only of this poem, but the thrust of the first saying, and that is, who discovers the meaning of these words? It doesn't say who believes these words, which is objectivism, objective religion, but who personally discovers the meaning of these words. Do you hear the difference?
Yeah.
The word discover, by the way, is the most used key word in the gospel. You would think, if this was traditional religion, you would think the word believe would be in the gospel, but it isn't. The whole gospel, the force of the entire gospel is on teaching people to discover their own meaning. And Jesus' words here are to be a stimulus for people to discover who they are, who other people are, the nature of the world, how the world works, and how they become a complete human being. I see the entire book, Miguel, as being a personal development manual.
And Bob, do you see the Gospel of Thomas set in any sort of thematic way, or you simply go down the sayings and figure things out?
It's progressive. And what I've done in this book is tried to show that he was developing that he was developing step by step, showing people how to free themselves from objective religion and actually I would say even any blind belief system, whether it's political or social or religious, in order for them to make their own personal discoveries. You've got to leave your indoctrination that you were given as a child in order to become a full human being. Otherwise, you're just a conformist, you're just a robot, you're wandering around in the world, you're not a human being. That's the thrust of the gospel. How to become a full human being.
So, Bob, in other words, our current translations of the Bible do not show some material as chiastic poems.
Almost none of the translations show the chiastic structure of the text. The Gospel of Mark is entirely chiastic poems. Nobody has seen that. You can find these chiastically arranged poems throughout Genesis. In fact, most of Genesis can be arranged that way. In the book, I show sections of Genesis and sections of Mark arranged that in a chiasm, and I spell out the rules so anybody can go to any section of the Bible now and find those arches or find text where they're not. You'll find the arches in Revelations. Interestingly enough, you don't find them at all in the letters of Paul. You don't find them in the letters of Peter or James. They're only in certain texts. You don't find them at all in the Old Testament, where you've got all the listing of laws. There's in Exodus, you go along with, you see the arch arrangement, all of a sudden it stops, you've got a list of laws forever, and then it starts up again in the next book.
Wow, that's definitely incredible. So this was actually an ancient esoteric way of imparting knowledge.
That's right, and I suspect it was used, I know it was used in Greek literature, but it was a Semitic method of conveying wisdom. I think what they were doing was conveying wisdom to each other in poetry so that people could easily memorize it. They used the arch form, and I'm not sure all the reasons, but one of them I spelled out in the book, and I don't know if I can go through it all here, but the arch has meaning in itself. For example, on the left side of the arch, you're taking in information. At the top of the arch, you either use that information to transform yourself, and on the right side of the arch is always the outcome of either being transformed or not being transformed. So in the poem that we did before, it says, whoever is the one, implied is whoever is the one who listens with the Spirit to his own inner knowing. That's what's implied in that stanza. In stanza 2, it says, who discovers the meaning of these words? In other words, who takes that information and uses it to discover their own meaning? Then the outcome is in stanza 3. He will take a taste not of death. And what he's talking about is not physical death. He's talking about psychological death. And I spell out in the book two different paths. One, what I call the way of life, and the other I call the way of death. Jesus was teaching the way of life. The way of death is exactly the opposite. Now let me explain briefly how you can tell whether you're alive or dead. To the degree that you're living in the moment, you're filled with joy, you're filled with love, with whatever is going on, no matter what problems are going on in your life, you are still filled with joy and love for even those problems. To that degree, you're living the way of life. To the degree that we are in our head, bouncing between the past and the future, between regrets and worries, between sadness and excitement, we are on the way of death. And so I finally, if you recall, I said I went into the Jesuits and soon found that I was really interested in finding out how Jesus' message affected mental health. Well, all of a sudden I found it here in this gospel. And he was describing mental health as the way of life and mental illness as the way of death. And so if you follow this gospel and if you live it, his goal is to bring us to incredible peace, incredible stillness with whatever is going on. And so I was very excited when I discovered this. Here I went into a doctorate program to discover the answers, and I found them in this book.
I definitely have to go take another read at the Gospel of Thomas now, even though I've read it so many times, but this is wonderful.
In the book, what I tried to do was show the poems in a chiastic fashion and then explain how you can use them to grow personally. That was what I was doing. I'm not trying to change what Jesus was saying. I'm trying to lift it out so that we can make it practical.
But Bob, I guess the question is, and some people, especially radical people, have said, like Earl Doherty and some people from the Jesus Seminary said that the Gospel of Thomas was actually a list of sayings that had been floating around even before Jesus was born and so forth, wisdom sayings of the Jews. How do you know, or what is your opinion on Jesus being the author of it?
let's go through. There's various proofs. The first is the date of composition. I haven't heard anybody say yet that there were saying that these sayings were before Jesus. That's possible, but who knows? I don't know how they could prove that unless they found it in other literature, and I haven't ever seen that. But there's a number of scholars. I'm coming to mind are April DeConick, Stephen Patterson, and there's others, and myself, who believe that this gospel had to have preceded the 4 canonical gospels. And the reason for that, coming to that conclusion, is that the sayings here, the same sayings we see here that we see in the are kind of a primitive form of the sayings that we see in the main gospel. They're stark. I would say it's primitive in the sense that they're very stark. In the gospels, they're filled out. They're embellished. Another reason for thinking that this was composed early is that it does not have any language that we find, or any of the phrases that we find in the letters of Paul. And Paul was very influential. He wrote about 20 years after Jesus. And so this would tend to show that it was written before Paul. Elaine Pagels, in her book Beyond Belief, argues that John, in writing his gospel, was refuting some of the things that are in this gospel. And so she definitely thinks that that the Gospel of Thomas was written early. My primary reason to think that Jesus wrote it is that you've got to, it's so tremendously organized. Only one person, in my judgment, could have done it. You can't organize a document like this into poems, into a chiastic structure, the chapters organized into a chiasm, without by committee. It has to be one person who knows this material inside and out in order to do it. And the person most likely, I think, that had the genius to do it would have been Jesus. And of course that's what it's stated in the beginning on the first saying. It said, and the first saying is, these are the words, those hidden, which Jesus, who lives, spoke. So that's the very first poem in the book. And then in the second poem, it says, and he wrote them, namely Didymus, Judas, Thomas. And so the internal evidence in the document indicates that Jesus was the author. There's also each major section of the gospel is preceded by a phrase that says, quote, and Jesus said. Now that phrase sometimes is modified, but someone went through over 115 times and wrote in the gospel, and Jesus said. It was almost like that person wanted to correct others who did not believe that Jesus was the author. Another reason why this gospel was most likely written by Jesus is that it does not contain any biography of Jesus. If Jesus were the author, we would expect that. He would want to convey his discovered wisdom, and he wouldn't want to glorify himself by saying, I went here, I went there, I healed this person, I healed that, I did this, I did that. What he was trying to do is leave want of a better word, a self-help book for people. He wanted people to become free of dogmatic religion, and he knew that was the way of death. And so he gave his life really to writing it. Another reason is, so I guess those are the main reasons why I come to the conclusion that Jesus probably wrote this document.
So basically, you move over Carl Jung and Freud, Jesus has you beat by 2,000 years. That's what I'm getting.
It's not only by 2,000 years, but by tremendous wisdom. This guy knew how to grow. I mean, when you go through it, he sat back, looked at the same world that we're looking at, saw people unconscious, and we're unconscious to the degree that we're walking around with other people's beliefs. And he said that is the source of mental illness. And here is how to correct that. That is genius.
So, Bob, so what I'm getting is you had Jesus of Nazareth, and his scribe was Thomas, and then later on other evangelists or followers decided to write down his deeds or mythology or whatever around it, which later became the Gospels.
What they did, I think, but we know that they had a number of sources. Mark started with having a number of sources, and this is probably one of the sources. There were others. When Jesus died, or when any great person who's wise dies, like Buddha, we know from the history of Buddha is that the first thing they do, all his followers do, is sit down and write down everything they can remember. Now, we've got to recall that these were oral cultures. They were memorizers. The people didn't write. They didn't have books, or they had very few of them. They had to memorize the wisdom of people. Jesus, knowing that and doing that, wrote these poems, recited them as he was walking around the country. People memorized the poems. Jesus also explained these poems. They may have remembered some of his explanations, but what they probably did is wrote down the kernel of his message, and the kernel was parables, sayings, poems. Jesus was a tremendous author, and so he may have written more books than this, and they have been lost. We know that a document or documents called Source Q existed, so we don't know how many collections of his sayings and his poems existed prior to the Gospel of Mark, which was the first gospel written. But Mark had all this material stretched out on his desk or wherever he was on his rock, and he then picked and chose in order to write his gospel. What he wanted to do was, clearly, was show Jesus in kind of a historical setting, but he wanted to incorporate a lot of his material, and he changed a lot of the sayings of Jesus. I mean, that was done then. And we know that then Luke changed some, and then Matthew changed some. So they took great liberty with Jesus' material.
So, Bob, I guess the $64,000 question would be, why didn't the Gospel of Thomas make it into the New Testament?
Great. Yeah, that's a huge question. We've got to remember that the gospel, the clergy, bishops, Catholic bishops, got together in the 4th century. Actually, they started in the 3rd, and they ended up at the end of the 4th century, arguing. They spent that time arguing about what books to include in the canon, what they called the Christian canon, which was created before the Jewish canon, the Bible. And you know, they almost didn't include Mark, Luke, and Matthew. Elaine Pagels points this out in her book, only wanting to include John, but it was a great debate. Now the question is, when they picked up and looked at what we know as the Gospel of Thomas, you can say, well, why didn't they include this? The answer is, to me, is pretty obvious. Because it's Gnostic. And by Gnostic, I mean it was teaching people to discover their own answers. Christianity, in my judgment, was started by Paul, and Paul was raised in objectively theological Judaism. He was taught how to think, and he was taught how to act, and he turned right around and said, Jesus, I love you, but you didn't get it right. He must have said that because he rarely quotes Jesus, or if he does, it's just by a phrase. He doesn't quote an entire parable. And he went off establishing objective, absolute beliefs and laws. That became Christianity, and that's what Christianity is doing today. It's indoctrinating people with what they consider objective truth. And that is the exact opposite of Gnosticism. Gnosticism does not do that. It frees people from indoctrination in order for them to discover their own meaning.
Bob, can you give us some examples of the between the differences between what Paul said and what Jesus said?
Do you remember that Paul said that Jesus died for our sins? Okay, that's an objective theological statement. That is not a description of experience, which is all right. He also stated that one needs to believe that truth in order to be saved. In other words, Paul thought that holiness resulted from when one believed objective doctrine, and that still persists. Jesus never said that he was dying for our sins. He never, and never is it reported in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, or in this gospel, that he declared an objective creed. He didn't do that. Gnostics don't do that. And he would never be so stupid as to think that one became an evolved human being by believing and acting according to institutional doctrine. Instead, he described growth phenomenologically. That is how he experienced it.
Do you think Jesus would have ever endorsed Paul?
Oh, of course not. No. Paul was declaring objective doctrine. Jesus was not doing that. Jesus was attacking any institution, not only Judaism, that tried to enslave people in blind objective beliefs. And that is why I think he died. Remember, the Romans had a good reason for him to die, to kill him, because they were indoctrinating people into their belief system. It doesn't matter whether it's a civil belief system or whether it's a religious belief system. As long as you're not freeing people to discover their own answers, you are not on the side of Jesus. Gnosticism is an approach to understanding reality. It is not a religion. It does not contain doctrine. So I was being taught Gnosticism when I was being taught at the Jesuits, when I was being taught phenomenology. That's my opinion. So we from the beginning of mankind, there's been two ways of knowing reality and becoming a full human being. One is that you discover your own truths, and daily you give up the truths that you discovered yesterday and rediscover them today. And the other is people who want other people to conform to their versions of reality, and that battle has been going on probably forever. And so after Jesus died, those two methods of knowing continued. But of course, the organized Catholic Church, in order to be organized, had to promulgate a creed, had to promulgate, this is what we believe, these are the rules we follow, these are our rituals, and these are the effects of the rituals. Now that is essential for an organization, a religion, to function. The Gnostics, as Elaine Pagels pointed out, were all over the place. And they didn't have an organization because they didn't have a creed. They were people in their homes who were just talking daily about their discoveries.
Right. I think April DeConnick talks. They probably met in lodges, in secret and stuff.
Well, sometimes they didn't have to meet in secret, but if there was anybody around who was like today, who was evangelical and wanted to be sure that everybody had the same truths, yeah, they had to meet in secret because they would be killed. That's been the history for 2,000 years. If you get outside doctrine, it's dangerous. Miguel, let me give you an example of a Gnostic group that I was running last year, and that might help understand, because I think what I was doing was exactly what was going on back in the first century. And I had a lot of friends who were interested in this gospel, and we would, it's just informal, and I would start it by just simply saying to the group, what have you discovered this week? And they knew what I meant. And I'm thinking right now of Katie. Katie's in her late 40s, and she works with her father. And she said they have a cattle ranch. And she said, I just made a big discovery about me and about my dad. And we all perked up, and she said, we were at a social gathering, and I was explaining something to an individual, and my dad was standing there with a drink, and he said, oh, no, that isn't right. And she said, I became livid. I was right back. She says, I was back as a teenager. He was again telling me, and here we are working as partners on this ranch. And she said, but I changed. I said, excuse me. And she says, I went into the powder room. And she said, I sat down and just became conscious of what my feelings were and what my thoughts were. And she said, I normally would just brush those aside, but I didn't. I let all the pain come up of that probably has been going on for 45 years. And she said, gradually I opened my heart to love my dad just the way he is. And as I did that, I began to see him as a different person. I began to see him as a person with strengths and with limitations, but not just my father. I began to see a man who was struggling in life. And she said he was revealed to me in a different way. And then I began to look at myself, and I saw that I didn't need to react with anger. I could love him just the way he is. And she said, gradually I became very still, and I found myself feeling one with my father, with myself, and with God. And so I got up and I went out, got another drink, and she said, walked over and very calmly said, Dad, I want to take up that conversation, which you said. I disagree with you. And my father jaw kind of dropped, she said, because I was talking out of love and there was no anger. I had evolved. Then she just paused and everybody kind of chirped in and said, well, geez, that's really neat. And here's what I hear you, how I think you've grown. And here's the process you were going through. And by golly, I was doing that this week too. And this is what I was discovering about myself. Well, that went on. We go on for 2 or 3 hours sitting there, watching the sun go down. That, to me, is a Gnostic meeting. That is a Gnostic church meeting. People making discoveries, people sharing love, and people sharing how to grow.
So basically, Katie, in your example, is describing how she was growing to be a more loving human being.
That's what the gospel is about. But notice what she was doing. She was not denying her feelings and thoughts. She was encountering them. She was not blaming her father for her anger. She was confronting herself. She opened to let the Spirit guide her in the process of seeing her father different and seeing herself different. Let me read one of the sayings. The saying 5 of Jesus is this. It says, know he who is in the presence of your face, and he who is hidden from you, he will be revealed to you. That's what Katie was doing. She was revealing her father to herself in a new way. Gnosticism is really a process of what I call peeling the onion. It starts with the belief that we never see reality. We're always in the process of disclosing reality. There are no objective truths in terms of ourselves, in terms of other people, in terms of how to grow. Objective in the sense that they lead toward personal growth. No, we have to, as we today, as we give up our current beliefs about ourselves, our current beliefs about others, we begin to take away the veil that prevents us from seeing reality.
But doesn't the Bible say that Jesus is the only Son of God? Where does that leave us?
Okay, that's a wonderful. Let me read you a poem about what he says about being the Son of God. In saying 3, he says, "When you should know yourself, then they will know you, and you will realize that you are the Son of the Father who lives." Let me say that again. When you should know yourself, and he means know yourself in the Gnostic way of peeling the onion, then they will know you, and you will realize that you are the Son of the Father who lives. And so he's not saying that he wasn't the Son of God, or the one wasn't the Son of the Father, but he's saying that we all are, at our core, the Son of the Father. But we don't know that. We hide that from ourselves. As we get to know ourselves, as Kitty was doing, gradually, we begin to recognize the truth that he discovered, which is that we're all the son or daughter of God.
What is the essence of Gnosticism as you define it?
It's a great question. A Gnostic, in my opinion, is a seeker of his own wisdom. And those words are loaded. A Gnostic does not allow another person to indoctrinate him, but rather is seeking his own truths. A Gnostic knows that the way he sees himself, others, and how the world works is not correct. He continually challenges himself to see reality as it is. Slowly, as I said, he peels the veils of unknowing from his eyes in order to be one with what really exists. Let me put it another way. A Gnostic never conforms to the beliefs of others. He tries not to do that. He knows he's done that, but he's trying to get away from that. Therefore, you won't find a Gnostic belonging to an organization that indoctrinates its members with its own version of truth. Another thing I've noticed is that a Gnostic believes in only what he experiences. And because he tries to experience reality more clearly every day, his beliefs change daily. A Gnostic, for example, would never believe in a God that he doesn't experience. And as he experiences God, as his experience of God changes, so does his beliefs. So it's an ongoing process. A Gnostic regards steadfast blind beliefs as the enemy, when an organized religion regards it as a virtue and as a friend. A Gnostic sees that blind beliefs hold you at a level of growth and prevent you from growing. Another thing we saw in Katie is that Gnostic is very introspective. He wants to be conscious of his every feeling and thought, and then he wants to use that information to know reality more clearly. A Gnostic is never satisfied with talking objectively about some event. He is concerned about what an event means to himself and others. So he's focused on meaning. For example, when talking to another who has been fired from his job, for example, he will ask questions like, he'll start by saying, what happened? But then he'll get to questions like, what does this mean for you? How does it affect your life? Or tell me how you deal with frustration and disappointment like that. A Gnostic is curious about the internal workings of another person because he wants to use that information to grow himself and because he wants to be one with the other person. Another thing I've noticed is that when it comes to knowing oneself, others, or how the world works, a Gnostic never is looking for absolute truth. He seeks what I call relative truth. For example, he will describe to another his experience of God, as we did out on that beach, and then he will listen while other people describe their experience of God. If two of us on that beach described God in similar ways, or our experience of oneness in similar ways, we would say that we came up with relative truth, tentative truths. If a third person said, hey, I experienced God that way too, okay, we've arrived at stronger relative truth. But in no case are we trying to define God as having three persons or as being absolutely knowing. We're trying to understand from each other better how we perceive and how we feel and how we think when we have a God experience. So those are kind of the things I look for in a person who doesn't even know they're Gnostic, but like the people on the beach didn't know they were Gnostic. They knew about this gospel, but I could tell what they were doing, that they were using the Gnostic approach to growth.
You call the Jesus book the way of life, and in the book you refer also to the way of death. What are some of example of those two ways, and what are some of the rewards once you find the way of life?
Kind of as I said before, as you grow on the way of life, you will see daily that you're more still at the end of the day than you were at the beginning. You're more full of love at the end of the day than you were at the beginning. That only happens when you spend time every day doing what Katie was doing. And Jesus teaches in his poems, he teaches how to do that. If you find yourself, for example, because of our current economic situation, more worried at the end of the day because of what you've read about money than you were at the beginning of the day, then you're growing on the way of death. You're developing habits of what Jesus calls death. You're becoming literally more mentally sick. The more we worry, the more we're anxious, the more we grieve, the more we're sad, the more we're depressed. That's all signs of being on the way of death. So again, the book is very practical. It's trying to bring us to a point in our life where even when someone dies who's a close friend, we still, while we miss that person, we're experiencing joy and love.
Oh, before we go, Bob, if somebody wants to contact you, how should they go about it?
I wish they would go to my website, which is www.7771.org. That's www.7771.org. And then there's a method of contacting me. I would love to get feedback, and I'd love to be in interaction with folks.
Okay, wonderful. Well, hopefully more people will come to you. Once again, thanks a lot, and we will be talking to you soon.